Welcome back to another front row episode on Economy.lk. Today we have a very, once again, another eminent personality and expert with us to talk to you in terms of some of the economic things that are going on in his country. So we'll have the pleasure to have with us Dr.Arvind Subramanian, who is the Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India. Good to have you, sir.
Thanks for having me.
So let's, I think, get right into it. I think one of the key things that have come under your tenure as the Chief Economic Advisor has been the reform in terms of GST. How difficult was getting that through in terms of getting it in place and implementing it? And we're now 1 year into it. How has the progress been?
Yeah, so it's been, I think, one of India's most difficult and transformational policy reforms, certainly one of the most transformational tax reforms that we've ever done. Just to give you a sense of the difficulty and complexity, think of kind of 29 or 30 countries coming together, giving up their fiscal sovereignty to levy taxes and to agree to pool their sovereignty and decide on all these things together. So it requires and involved a certain element of, kind of giving up your freedom for the sake of a larger good. So it was extraordinarily difficult as a political enterprise. So that's first. But in terms of implementation too, remember it involved one tax all over India we've tried to keep rates simple and so on. And it's involved again, the tax administrations of 29 states, the center, and it's involved an enormous new feat of technology where every transaction is now recorded and digitalized and so on. So it's been extraordinarily complicated exercise, and there have been kind of challenges in its implementation. But I think first year, 1 year on, I can say with all honesty that it's surprised me completely on the upside. For example, revenue performance has been very good. We've discovered, for example, that the tax buoyancy of the GST is much greater than previous taxes were. It's also, contrary to what we feared earlier, we thought some states would lose a lot. It turned out that mostly states haven't lost, and so in that sense, revenue performance has been terrific. Of course, I think there is a full reform agenda ahead, which is that we have to simplify it a bit more. There are probably still too many rates. We have to bring in more and more products into the GST. A few ones have been kept out, like petroleum and electricity and so on. But I think these are all things that will be discussed and decided going forward. Exporter refunds are also now, we're facing some challenges. But all of this, I think the important thing is that we have mechanisms and a kind of institutional framework to try and resolve these problems as they come up.
And if I just may ask, how did the economic case you put forward to some of these states to think about the bigger picture? How difficult was that?
You see, it was difficult and not difficult in the following sense, that because the GST involved moving from a predominantly production-based tax to a consumption-based tax, and since the consuming states are the poorer states and they are the bigger states, so it was in that sense in the interest of some of the poorer states and the bigger states to buy into it, because it was so the difficulty was more in persuading the states that were likely to lose, for example, and the way the government did that was to promise all states a minimum revenue growth of 14%. So that was and the center said, if you fall short, we will compensate you. So a combination of the fact that it naturally helped some of the bigger, larger states, plus the government stepping in and saying we will protect everyone's revenue base. I think a combination of that, reassured the states.
And we've seen, I think, economic survey documents in India preluding, I think, a budget, if I'm not mistaken. How important is such a document like that to drive some of the national agenda and make policy more data driven, more evidence driven?
So I think that in the last I've done 4 full surveys, and I think that one of the real gratifications of the job has been how well the survey has been received. For example, just a little bit of self-boasting here, the last survey that we did in 4 months has received 15 million hits from about 500,000 unique visitors from 170 countries. I was surprised that people in Chad want to read the Indian Economic Survey. So that's, but the survey serves two purposes. One is, as you said, to try and provide ideas for immediate policy making. So that's a big part of the thing. And the second is also to seed the intellectual ecosphere with broader ideas that may not be taken up immediately, but over time. So just to give you one example, we raised the profile of this idea of universal basic income, for example. It's not that it's been implemented by any state now, but it's more and more become part of the discussions. And so I think that over time, it will kind of at some stage or the other gain popular salience and hopefully get implemented. So and for that, as you said, we use a lot of data, we use new data. We try and present this in interesting, creative ways. And above all, we try and make it accessible to, the fact that there have been 15 million hits shows that, it reaches a lot of people. And I do think that the task for any kind of economist or technocrat, apart from also coming up with ideas, is to try and communicate these ideas. Because ultimately in a democracy, I think economic decisions should be deliberated by the public at large, and they should provide inputs into policy making.
And I think if you look right now, a lot of the challenges that oil importing countries like Sri Lanka and India faces is the rising oil prices and what that means. And we're also, there's a risk of the dollar, appreciating, currencies are depreciating.
Right.
With those contemporary challenges, maybe near term, how do you balance those with some of the more structural reforms that economies like Sri Lanka needs to propel growth to a more sustainable level?
Right. I think, remember that all economic policy, at least the long-run structural reform changes, can only really realistically and effectively be implemented if there's macro stability. That's a precondition. And at the moment, we are seeing challenges to macro stability. And as you said, Sri Lanka and India are in slightly similar situations. We're net oil importers. And not just the fact of the dollar appreciating, but the fact that the Chinese currency and all Asian currencies are also declining also has impacted us. So what I say is that to some extent, the natural market forces will lead to some adjustment of the currency. I think depending upon how much central banks have in terms of reserves, they can also cushion some of the impact of that. But over and above that, I think at least more broadly fiscal policy, macro policy should not add to these. There should be a kind of Hippocratic do no further harm, maintain macro stability, fiscal stability, so that hopefully you can tide through this and then create the conditions for the economy to be able to implement the structural reforms that the economy needs. So I think maintaining macro stability in these volatile times is very challenging. It's not going to be easy. It is going to involve some adjustment. It is going to involve some hardship for some sections of society. But that's where I think it's the political process has to make the case and to cushion the impact so that long-run structural reforms can be implemented.
Sure. So there you heard it. I think within the short span of time, we were able to understand how some of the key reforms in terms of GST took place, the role of evidence-based, data-based reports that will drive overall government policy, and some of the contemporary challenges and how macro stability, I think, lays the foundation for more of the structural reform. So thank you, Dr. Arvind,
Thank you very much,
for being on Economy.lk. And for our viewers, stay tuned for more episodes like this.